So we're going to go ahead and get started here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm David McDonald. I'm the coordinator for the Cultural Engagement and Inclusion Office here at Muskingum. So first I want to start by saying good evening to you all. Thank you for being here. I'm very excited for this presentation. It's an absolute honor to welcome tonight's distinguished speaker, Dr. Hasan Kwame Jeffries. He's a historian, an educator, an advocate for truth. Dr. Jeffries has spent his career illuminating the struggles and triumphs of African Americans in the ongoing fight for justice and equality. He's the author of Bloody Lounds, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt, and the host of the Teaching Hard History podcast. His work extends far beyond the classroom. He has helped redesign the National Civil Rights Museum and contributed to the award-winning documentaries, including Fight the Power, How Hip Hop Changed the World. A professor at the Ohio State University, Dr. Jeffries is committed to teaching what he calls hard history, the lessons that we must confront to understand our past and shape our future. Tonight, in honor of Black History Month and the 2025 theme, African Americans and Labor, Dr. Jeffries will explore how generations of Black Americans have fought through labor and activism to preserve democracy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hasan Kwame Jeffries.
David, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
You can thank me later for the warm weather that I brought in Columbus, Ohio. It's a short drive because I actually I live in Pickerington, so I live on the east side of Columbus. So it was a nice drive over here. And although I've been teaching at the Ohio State University, home of the 2024 National Championship football. Go Bucks! For the last 2 decades, 20 some years, I received my undergraduate degree from Morehouse College, which is a historically Black college in Atlanta, Georgia, a small liberal arts college. And so it's wonderful to be back in that setting. I truly appreciate these spaces and what is done and the kind of work that is done in small liberal arts colleges with red clay buildings sitting up on a hill, which is exactly where Morehouse is in Atlanta, Georgia. So it's good to be with you. I want to share some thoughts and ideas on this theme, putting in the work to preserve democracy, as we begin the 2025 Black History Month. One of my students introduced me to this little curtain. I like that to open it up. The Association for the Study of African American Life and History is the leading organization of scholars and educators that focus on African American history, professional organization. It also has community roots, community members are a part of it. It was started at the turn of the 20th century, 1915, 1916, 1917, by Carter G. Woodson, who was recognized as the father of Black history, one of the first African Americans to receive a PhD from Harvard, and committed his life to uncovering, sharing, developing resources for teachers about the Black experience, about the African American experience, about the African experience. And it's the Association for the Study of African American Life and History that every year identifies a theme for Black History Month, hoping that people will take up this theme as they reflect upon the achievements, the accomplishments, but also the struggles that African Americans have been engaged in over the 400 some years that we have been here. And this year's theme is African Americans and labor. African Americans and labor. And I like this theme because there's a lot you can do with it. There's a lot you can do with labor. And of course, when we think about labor in the African American context, it's important to identify and recognize and acknowledge that African Americans have put in a lot of work laboring for other people. When we go back to the very origins of this nation, it's important for us to acknowledge this relationship between racism and capitalism. Racism and capitalism, to me, are not simply sort of characteristics of American society, but they are foundational. And the two combined are very much woven into the fabric of our society. I see them as the two strands of the double helix of America's DNA. It is racism and capitalism that gave us the institution of slavery. Capitalism being the driving, motivating force, the exploitation of African and African American labor, and racism, a belief in white supremacy, serving as the rationalization, not the motive force, but the rationalization, that which made it okay and acceptable to dehumanize, to exploit generations of African people. Racism and capitalism, that the strands of our DNA giving us the institution of slavery. It's racism and capitalism that gave us a century of Jim Crow. A century of Jim Crow. When I talk to my students down the road, and I ask them often if I'm teaching an introductory class on U.S. history or African American history, I say, well, what happened like after emancipation? Like, how did white Southerners sort of respond to this moment of freedom and the end of slavery? And usually my students are like, well, they were probably like, our bad. Like, we didn't realize like it was this bad, like I really wanted freedom, but you know, it's all cool now, right? No. A slaveholder mentality persisted after emancipation. And what does that mean? The sense that whites were entitled to control black labor and regulate black behavior. The institution of slavery as an economic system designed to control black labor is abolished. Right? 13th Amendment knocks that out, that's done, that's over with. But two things persist. That enslaver mentality in the South, this idea that as white Southerners we are entitled to control black labor, and the belief in white supremacy. That does not go away. So we get not racism, again, racism and capitalism moving from slavery to this new thing called Jim Crow. And we often think about Jim Crow and talk about Jim Crow as being sort of an inconvenience for black folk. They couldn't ride on the back of the front of the bus or drink from a refrigerated water fountain in the Deep South. But Jim Crow was an economic system, right, that goes through, that has these various iterations, but again, it was rooted in this desire to exploit African American labor. So this was just one iteration of what Jim Crow was, the convict lease system. Right? I mean, you had sharecropping in Tennessee, but you also had this convict lease system, described by some as slavery by another name. From the 1870s to the 1930s or so, throughout the South, African Americans are arrested on trumped up charges, overwhelmingly African American men, but also African American women, and to a lesser degree African American children, arrested on trumped up charges and then literally leased out, sold to large plantation owners as well as to industries, timber, mining, timber in Florida, mining in Alabama. U.S. Steel was one of the big convict lease, one of the big companies involved in convict leasing. The exploitation of African American labor, laboring for others, for no wages, at great risk to your life. If you were a convict leasee in Birmingham, Alabama, leased to U.S. Steel and working in one of the mines in Birmingham, Alabama, your life expectancy in the mines was about 2 years. You had to hope that you got out before 2 years. The mortality rate for those who were leased out in the mines in Birmingham in the late 1890s was about 30%. 30% of those who went in never went out, which means that you had a better chance of surviving the Middle Passage than you did a mine in Birmingham in 1890. The exploitation of African American labor, laboring for others. Racism and capitalism gives us Jim Crow. Racism and capitalism also gives us mass incarceration. What do you do when you're no longer needed to labor for others as you once were? The solution to that, as we have seen, has been the warehousing of black labor. And the capitalism comes into play because there's profit in warehousing people. Forget about the work that folks do. If anybody shops at Kroger, much of your meat today here in central Ohio is butchered at a prison right down I-70-71, prison labor. And we say, yeah, they're giving them opportunities, giving them skills. It's prison labor. It's prison labor. They're not being paid the same wages as you would on the outside. And then, of course, we pass all these laws and measures, federal but also state, that make it harder for those who have acquired some skills on the inside to translate those into actual jobs on the outside. To say nothing of the fact of how much private corporations generate here in Ohio, with private prisons, in terms of actually making money off of warehousing people. Racism and capitalism. And we're okay with it, in large part, disproportionate percentage of African Americans in bondage, because that racism is real. That racism is real. But at the same time, I get that sometimes my students say, Dr. Jeffries, after we get through the first couple of lessons, background information on African American history, like Dr. Jeffries, you're depressing the hell out of us. Like, well, you know, American history is kind of depressing when you actually look at it. But there's two sides to this. It's not only laboring for others. We've also seen African Americans throughout their time in the United States, throughout their time in America, colonial period to the present, have been laboring for freedom. Right? They say, Dr. Jeffries, you're taking all the hope away. It's like, no, the hope isn't in the experiences that people have had, the tragedy. The hope is in the fact that folk have always been fighting for freedom. There's never a time where black folk have not been fighting for freedom, laboring for freedom. The persistence of resistance, just as we have sort of racism is encoded and capitalism together are encoded in our DNA as Americans, for the African Americans, the persistence of resistance is as equally embedded in who we are. There is never a time where black folk are not fighting for their freedom. A literal freedom from slavery, or fighting to secure those rights that enslaved people identified, civil rights and human rights, as the crux of freedom, what I call freedom rights. We live here in Ohio, and I learned very quickly when I moved here to Ohio some 2+ decades ago, that Ohioans are obsessed with the Underground Railroad. Obsessed, love. So one thing, like the students know, that Ohio came in as a free state. 1803 came as a free state, but for the wrong reasons. But that's a separate. They didn't want black people here. And white folk my students get very excited, like Dr. Jeffries. Like, I know Ohio came in as a free state. I'm like, yes, Ohio came in as a free state, but for the wrong damn reason. Right? 1803 Constitution said, we don't want black people here. And so if a black person does come, they have to pay $500 against their future criminality. White Ohioans did not want slavery here because they didn't want the slaveocracy bringing in black laborers. They didn't want free blacks coming in either because they feared the labor competition as well. Ohio came in on the right side of history, but for the wrong reasons. But we're obsessed. Our kids are obsessed. We're obsessed with teaching. Anytime I talk to K-12 teachers, what do you talk about when we talk about African Americans? We talk about the Underground Railroad. It's like, all right, that's good. But now the effect of that and the way it's taught is if I'm in a class with my students and I ask them, I say, raise your hands if you would have been a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Guess how many hands go up? Every single hand. And I'm like, that's wonderful. But if that was then, it's not reality. If everybody would have been a conductor on the Underground Railroad, it would not have had to have been underground. Right? There's a reason why. But that doesn't take away the resistance aspect. Right? African Americans are always fighting. The question I get in thinking about laboring for freedom, it's like, well, Dr. Jeffries, like if African Americans were constantly fighting against the institution of slavery and engaged in this fight, then how come there aren't more rebellions? How come there aren't more insurrections? If you're trying to be free, then how come there aren't more rebellions in the United States? You hear this as sort of a counterfactual. And that's actually the wrong question. the right question, if we understand some of the demographics and the way that power works in colonial America and the United States, the right question is how come there are any rebellions at all? Because rebellion in the United States, open outright rebellion, picking up arms, trying to overthrow the institution of slavery through force of arms, was suicide. It was suicide. There's only one really successful rebellion in this hemisphere, and that's the Haitian Rebellion. In the United States, and they had demographics on their side. In the United States, if you were an enslaved African American, you surely could take out the person who was holding you in bondage. That's easy. You can take out an enslaver, a plantation owner, you can take out their family, you could even take out a couple of their neighbors. But then how far are you going to get after that? Because soon you're going to deal with the county militia or the slave patrol, then the county militia. Get past the county militia, you're going to deal with colonial or state militia. And if you got past them, you got to deal with the federal army. Everything was arrayed against you. And the thing that African Americans wanted to do most of all was to live. They were not suicidal. We are not suicidal people. So the resistance is there, but it's on a spectrum. It's the small and the large, right? It's the visible and the unseen. Resistance to slavery. African Americans are also resisting Jim Crow, right? Laboring for their freedom. Laboring for others, but at the same time laboring for their freedom to give new meaning to their lives. This is an image of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. At the turn of the 20th century, Oklahoma and Greenwood in Tulsa is one of the thriving black communities in the United States. These were African American Southerners who move and migrate to Oklahoma, picking up what they had left behind in the South because they understood and hoped for new opportunities there. And in Tulsa, Oklahoma, they build big. They build this thriving African American community. Hundreds of black businesses, black hospitals, black schools, fraternal organizations. The wealthiest African American in the time lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Black businessmen, black theaters, black newspapers. The ways in which African Americans resisted in a segregated world was to build their own. And not just simply suffering in silence. This is during the height of lynching. 2 to 3 African Americans publicly murdered somewhere in the United States every week for 30 to 40 years. And the federal government saying that we can't do anything about it. And yet we get a Tulsa, Oklahoma, Greenwood, known as the Black Wall Street. And this wasn't an isolated incident or isolated place. You see something similar happening in Atlanta, Georgia. You see something similar happening in Richmond, Virginia. You see something similar happening in Durham, North Carolina. There wasn't just a Black Wall Street, there were Black Wall Streets. But there's also a high cost to laboring for freedom. And we see that high cost paid in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In 1921, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma is bombed and burnt to the ground. Bombed and burnt to the ground. Black Wall Street is destroyed. It had been targeted because it was successful. African Americans as a group are really the only people who have this experience of building, succeeding, and having everything torn away. Laboring for others, at the same time laboring for themselves, able to accomplish something and then having it destroyed. Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921. And Tulsa wasn't alone. We see smaller black communities being targeted, Rosewood, Florida, for example. We see in the summer of 1919, riots, we call them race riots, but these were really pogroms directed at African American communities, not just in the South or the West, but in the Northeast and the Midwest as well. There was a cost for pursuing freedom, yet African Americans still pursued it. The story of Tulsa, for those who even recall it and know about it, when they learn about it, we usually stop right here and say, oh, it was terrible. It's tragic, 1921, Tulsa's burned and bombed to the ground. We're still figuring out how, literally Tulsa, Oklahoma is, and the federal government are still finding bodies, still finding mass graves. Hundreds of folk were killed. The Justice Department, the last Justice Department, the administration, when they were still doing some good stuff, literally the last day of the last administration, produced a report on the findings. And one of the conclusions is something that historians have already known, but it was still good to see it confirmed and verified by the Justice Department. They said that there was state involvement. This wasn't just sort of renegade white folk who were upset. I mean, there was state involvement, not just the police, but then also the state National Guard. There had always been these sort of rumors on the ground of airplanes dropping bombs, incendiary devices on Tulsa, Oklahoma, on Greenwood, and the Justice Department said that is in fact the case. But black folk rebuilt. They rebuilt. They labored even further for their freedom. So what destroys Tulsa, what destroys Greenwood, you still have folk there, but what destroys the community, they rebuild this community in the same place. What destroys it is not racial terrorism and racial violence. What actually kills Tulsa is something that happens in the 1950s. It's an interstate that plows through the heart of Greenwood, not by accident. And that is actually what leads to the demise of the community. It's still there in fragments. If you ever get a chance to go to Tulsa, Oklahoma, go to Greenwood. There's a powerful museum that opened not too long ago that talks about the Greenwood district. And you can see as you're standing right there where the museum is, if you turn to the left, there you get the major interstate that destroys, separates community, destroys businesses, destroys housing. Something else that black folk had to deal with. African Americans have been laboring for others. African Americans have been laboring for freedom. African Americans have been laboring for democracy. Have been laboring for democracy. All those who have been obsessed about, so I'd have been on the right side of history and been with the Underground Railroad. Unfortunately, you would not have, not enough of us. But that's okay. That doesn't take anything away. We'll get our shot. That doesn't take anything away from us in this moment, and it doesn't take anything away from those who fought in the past. The reality is most folk were not engaged in active abolition. They just weren't. You don't have that many people participating in these social movements. Most people are on the sidelines. Any major social movement, most people are on the sidelines. They may engage for a moment or two, but most folk are on the sidelines. It's usually a dedicated few who are willing to sacrifice everything, who are at the forefront of these movements, who are making a big difference. And here are two folks. Frederick Douglass to the left, Sojourner Truth to the right. Sojourner Truth has Ohio history. Sojourner Truth in the early 1850s gives her a very famous Aren't I a Woman speech. We think about Sojourner Truth. I learned about Sojourner Truth as a New Yorker, right? Not realizing that she gives that speech in Akron, Ohio, talking about the meaning of freedom and talking about what it means to be a black woman in search of freedom. And then, of course, we have Frederick Douglass, part of this abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement was led by black folk who were willing to fight this, but there were white allies. Not everybody in Ohio, not every white person in America, but there were some white allies that were critically important, including John Brown. And John Brown was an abolitionist who, again, has Ohio roots, Ohio ties. He was living here in Ohio in the 1850s, right in Akron, not too far from where the church where Sojourner Truth gave her speech. Had a home there. And John Brown is the kind of person that we need to be lifting up when we think about laboring for democracy and engaging in coalition. Because John Brown was willing not only to sacrifice his life to end the institution of slavery, like his commitment was that deep on moral grounds. He said this is a moral evil, and the only way we can get rid of this is if we take up arms to defeat those who are trying to maintain the institution of slavery. Not only was he willing to give up his life, which he did, he was also willing to give up the lives of his sons. That's commitment. That's how serious this was. Now, when we think about John Brown and we think about Sojourner Truth, and even sometimes when we think about Frederick Douglass, we say, oh, they say they were crazy. Like John Brown in particular. Like John Brown, he was a fanatic. That's how he's been framed. He's a fanatic. Why? I mean, just think about if you could conjure in your mind, I don't have an image, sort of the famous portraits of John Brown, it's like the hair is all crazy and he's a fire in his eyes and all stuff. That's nonsense. One of the things that we do with people who are committed is what we dismiss them by calling them crazy. We dismiss them by calling them crazy, because if they're crazy, you don't have to take them seriously, you don't have to take them seriously, you don't have to take their ideas seriously. This idea of being committed to ending slavery. And John Brown was right. The only way that slavery ended in America was through the force of arms. It took a war. Now, strategically, you needed the government to come in. This is what Frederick Douglass understood. Laboring for democracy. He said, we cannot have a democracy in this nation as long as slavery exists. African Americans understood that even if you were free, you could not enjoy your full civil rights and human rights as long as slavery existed somewhere. If you were a free black in Ohio after 1850 and the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, you realized you couldn't stay here. You ran the risk of being kidnapped. I mean, that was always a risk, but it was a heightened risk after 1850. So if you were black anywhere, you had to fight to end slavery. You were an abolitionist in some way, shape, or form, because there was no way for you to enjoy the fundamentals of a democratic nation as long as slavery existed. So this is why when the war begins, Frederick Douglass turns to Abraham Lincoln and says, you have to make this a war to end slavery. And Abraham Lincoln is like, that's not what this is about. We get caught up, you know. Northerners, we love us, even love us from Abraham Lincoln, right? Abraham Lincoln was on the right side of history. Abraham Lincoln, Father Abraham, the great abolitionist, the great emancipator. Abraham Lincoln was a white supremacist. He believed in white supremacy, and that should come as no shock. What white person in America in the 1860s didn't? People are like, no, not Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, Frederick Douglass. That's his one black friend. And he wasn't even listening to Frederick Douglass. It takes him 3 years before he's like, you know what, I think we do need to make this a war to end slavery. Just because you're an abolitionist does not mean you believe in racial egalitarianism. It doesn't take anything away from Abraham Lincoln. It just puts him in his proper historical context. He had to be moved politically because the moral on the idea of racial equality, racism and capitalism, he had to be pushed there out of military necessity. But Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, John Brown, and eventually Abraham Lincoln, abolitionists, got to get rid of slavery if we're either going to save the nation or have a more democratic one. And then during Reconstruction or the Civil War, African Americans taking up arms. Not just passively waiting for this thing to happen, but saying, you know what, we are going to make this nation democratic, we are going to be full citizens or full members of this nation that we have to fight for, and they were. That's what Douglass was saying, 1863, make them, make it possible for African Americans to fight in the war. During Reconstruction, African Americans laboring for democracy. There's this period immediately after emancipation when white Southerners, after Lincoln is assassinated and Andrew Johnson becomes President of the United States, he's ushering in, welcoming back in these sort of the planters, the Confederates. Right? It's like, don't worry about it, here, have your land back. Right? Which pisses off Republicans who are like, wait a minute, we just fought this bloody war and we won, right? There needs to be some cost, and as a result of Johnson's shenanigans, we wind up getting what? Not the 13th Amendment, but we wind up getting both the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. 14th Amendment because what Johnson does in allowing Southern Democrats to do what they wanted, which at the time was what? Which at the time was to look to states like Ohio and copy the discriminatory laws that they had created to manage and control free blacks and apply them to the South. Jim Crow was born in the North. It's Boston that segregates public schools. It's New York that segregates streetcars. It's Ohio that segregates labor. White Southerners are like, yo, what are we gonna do with this new free black population? They say, we're gonna do what Ohio does. We're gonna do what New York does. We're gonna do what Illinois does. And so they withhold extending basic civil rights to African Americans. Republicans are like, nope, we know where this is gonna go. So we get the 14th Amendment, which we're hearing a lot about now, so that folk who are here, people who are here, human beings will not have their basic civil rights and human rights trampled on. 1857, the Supreme Court says black folk, African Americans have no rights which the white man is bound to respect. 14th Amendment is like, no. Human beings, they're here, full citizenship, simply by your presence, simply by being born, simply because you are here. But that ushers in this period of radical reconstruction. African Americans now, once they have the vote in hand, are able to participate in electoral politics. And you know what they do? They usher in democracy in the South. The first public schools, for example, the first public school systems in the South are a result of African Americans serving in state legislatures and saying we need public education, not just for black folk, but for all folk. White people poor white folk, working class white people in the South before the Civil War, they didn't have schools. There was no public education. Extending democracy, not just to African Americans, but to everyone. And then of course we get the civil rights and the Black Power movement, which is about extending democracy, securing those rights that were won after emancipation during the Civil War, and reinforcing protections for them. Whether we're talking about voting rights, education rights, doing away with segregation in education, separate and unequal. But again, not just saying, hey, let's be a part of this, but we should remove barriers for participating in democracy, for being full citizens in this country, for everyone. For everyone. Certainly African Americans are being targeted, but there's a universal understanding of what they're fighting for is to benefit everybody. There's a commitment to making democracy real. And we see that in the struggle for civil rights and for black power. Now black power, people get, we frame black power as the reason why the civil rights movement died. That's ridiculous. Black power was a logical extension of the successes and the frustrations of the slow pace of progress. And black folk just being more explicit and saying we have to deal with, we're gonna counter these sort of white nationalist, white supremacist ideas. We're going to talk about it in terms of blackness, and we're going to critique systemic racism. We're moving beyond hearts and minds, and we're going to deal with systems and structure. That's all Black Power was, an extension. The abolitionist movement feeds into Reconstruction. Reconstruction feeds into efforts to overturn or eliminate Jim Crow, which is civil rights and Black Power, and that feeds into what we saw most recently in the Black Lives Matter movement. For some reason, we've moved so quickly past that. We saw in the summer of 2020 the largest public protest in American history. Not even close. Nothing else comes even close. We're talking about 20 to 30 million people taken to the streets in the middle of a global pandemic. In June of 2020, another 20 to 30 million taken to the streets in July of 2020. Demanding justice for the victims of police violence like George Floyd, but also calling for an end to systemic racism. Saying let's make this democracy real. That's what that was, and that's an extension of what came before. That just becomes a sort of very visible manifestation of the efforts of folk. And people say, is this part of the African Americans laboring for democracy? Yes. But it was also, we also got to acknowledge that the vast majority of people who were out there were white. Ain't that many people, ain't that many black people in America. Coalition, extending, understanding, like this isn't just about sort of a black struggle, this is about everybody. Now black folk at the center of it, we take a lot of heat, but this is about everyone. But when we think about, why don't we talk about history in those terms? Why don't we talk about what it takes to actually build and extend and make democracy? It is because, I submit, that we are, as a nation, we hate history. the TED Talk, right? We hate history. What we love is nostalgia. We hate history. We hate those aspects of the past that make us uncomfortable in the present. And race is certainly one of them. Our struggles around trying to make democracy real is one of them. But we love nostalgia. We love stories about the past that make us feel comfortable in the present. We love stories about the past that make us feel comfortable in the present, even if they're not real. So what does that look like? That looks like the founders of the nation. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And we run with that. Like we actually have people running around now, and it's coming up again, the 1776 Project and all this other stuff, that the founders were actually abolitionists. I'm like, okay, if they were abolitionists, they were like the worst abolitionists. All right? It takes them 90 years. Like, no, stop. Why are we saying that? Why are we pretending, right? Because if they were something else, then that makes us uncomfortable. If we talk about them as enslavers, that makes us uncomfortable. But they said all men are created equal. If you know, it applies to everyone. No, it did not. They were so secure in who they were talking about. Rich white men with property and power, that they did not need to qualify. They did not need to say, except women, except poor people, except black folk, except Native American folk. But what we've done, and this is what it means to labor for democracy, we look back at those founding documents, whether it's the Constitution, which enshrines slavery and puts in protections for the institution of slavery, or the Declaration of Independence, which uses this universal language. We look back, and this is what folk who have engaged in laboring for democracy the entire time, and say, listen, we're going to put some new meaning in that. See, this is where you messed up, Thomas Jefferson. You used this universal language. We know this is not what you meant, because you were an enslaver. You owned 300 folk. After your wife dies, you have her half-sister, Sally Hemings. You're 45, she's 15. That's not romance, that's rape. So we know who you are, but you use this universal language and thinking, and James Madison, a political genius, thinking about these things. But they're also drawing on their own experiences. James Madison, architect of the Bill of Rights, is reading the great philosophical Enlightenment thinkers, but he's also just looking out of his window of his library at the 100 or so people he's holding in bondage. And so when he's like, well, what rights do we need protected against government if we are going to be free? All the things that I'm keeping away from these people. Like they're drawing on their own experiences. And we need to think about that. And we need to be serious about critiquing that. Because now you got folk running around talking about, well, we need to have the political conservative line. We need to be thinking about sort of the original arguments, original intent. They were buying and selling people. Like we need to move beyond exactly what they were thinking and what it limited. I think we can do better than that. I've been accused online. I really should stop getting off of social media. Like you don't want kids and students to be like the founders. I'm like, you're right. I don't, because I think we can be better. Because I know we can be better. I want them to see what works, to see what makes sense, but then also to see the flaws and move beyond. To confront that kind of hard history. The Confederacy. The hard history of the Confederacy. Got kids running around here talking about slavery wasn't the central cause of the Civil War. Well, what was? And this is especially relevant in the moment that we find ourselves now. Because this is the one moment in American history where you have people who are actively trying to break the government. Who are actively trying to break America. They're saying it's not working for us. and what it leads to is a war. And there are really important lessons that we need to take from that in the moment that we find ourselves in. Because what was for many, the rationalization for that kind of separation and going to that extent? It was white supremacy. Maintaining the institution of slavery because you need to control that black labor force. That becomes the common thread that we'll see a century and a half later. The hard history, like one of the things that we wrestle with, I think, as Americans, that we're burdened with, is the myth of perpetual progress, particularly as it relates to democracy, but also as it relates to the extension of basic civil rights and human rights. We say things were bad once, but they always get better. Especially as it relates to race, right? Like when it was slavery, but you have Reconstruction. African Americans elected to public office. You have Reconstruction, you have you go from Frederick Douglass to Martin Luther King. You're going to talk about Dr. King dreaming on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, but you're not going to talk about the reason why he was there. You don't want to talk about Jim Crow. Perpetual progress. Then we'll go from Barack Obama or Martin Luther King to Barack Obama, and now Barack Obama to Beyonce. Like she won a Grammy in country music, no less. Right? That's progress. That's perpetual progress. Things always get better, but we overlook things like what happens after Reconstruction. What happens to American democracy in the 1870s? We have this small moment, this small window, where African Americans are trying to reimagine what not just freedom ought to look like, but what America ought to look like. And white Southerners are not happy. They do not want it. We're often taught that Reconstruction fails. Reconstruction does not fail. Reconstruction is defeated. It's defeated by racial terrorists. It's defeated in part by Northerners, white Northerners who were like, look, we're done with this quickly, within 4 or 5 years. And so by 1890, this is a photograph of the Mississippi State Legislature, or convention delegates, the delegates to the 1890 Mississippi State Convention, that is called for the sole purpose, and you notice on two ends, it's simply two African Americans, called for the sole purpose of disenfranchising African Americans. She said, well, Dr. Jeffries, how do you know that? Because they said it. Literacy tests, poll tax, grandfather clause. Now in that language is race neutral. That language is colorblind. But the intent was clear and obvious. And they're talking about it in the convention notes and minutes. Every single state in the Confederacy, except North Carolina, rewrites their state constitutions between 1890 and 1910 for the sole purpose of disenfranchising African Americans. Because if you can take African Americans out of the body politic, then they can't have any influence or say on laws that you put into place to protect the new economic order. And that's what we see. I remember talking about these laws that are changed, all colorblind. None of them mention race. You can't mention race anymore because of the 14th, 15th Amendment in that way. All colorblind. But in intent and impact directed at African Americans. This is going to limit democracy. And it's all done democratically, put in quotes. I was in North Carolina talking about this, and somebody raised their hand and said, well, Dr. Jeffries, North Carolina, God bless North Carolina. North Carolina does not rewrite its state constitution. I said, you know why? They're like, because they were racial egalitarians? No. In 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, they lead a racial program. Wilmington is the most populous, it's the largest city in North Carolina. It's the economic hub, seaport of North Carolina. And it's run by African Americans and white Republicans. And white supremacy triumphs in Wilmington, North Carolina through a racial massacre and a political coup. They don't need to rewrite their state constitution because they eliminated the last vestiges of African Americans through violence. We see in the 1960s massive resistance. Again, this idea, whether that resistance, it's Birmingham, Alabama, it's in Mississippi, it's in Arkansas, but eventually it would reach its way to Ohio and to Columbus and to Cleveland, and when people start talking about where we're going to build houses and stuff like that, what our neighborhoods and schools going to look like. But massive white resistance to democracy, to extending and expanding democracy. There has always been this push, as African Americans have been laboring for democracy, to expand democracy, to limit it. We don't talk enough about what happens in the 1960s and the opposition. That's why you got white moms, like Moms for Liberty, the little daddy issue. Moms for Liberty, trying to ban books about little black children, desegregating schools. Ruby Bridges, 1960, banned in school districts in Florida and Tennessee. Why? Because it shows that folk were opposed to democracy. How do you explain that grandma was out there yelling at a 6-year-old girl? Talk to students as students go through these processes when you reveal these things to them. They're like, well, maybe, Dr. Jeffries, I don't know, maybe grandma didn't really understand. It's like, no, Mima was a racist. Like, you just need to accept that. It doesn't reflect negatively on you. Like, you weren't there, but you got to accept that. And make sure you don't backslide. Massive resistance. And then, Ronald Reagan, I almost long for the days of Ronald Reagan. But Reagan laid the groundwork for all of this. The effort to undermine democracy today and to destroy and break government, break the federal government, can be tied directly back to the Reagan Revolution. And the rationalizing around race and racism. Ronald Reagan, this is Ronald Reagan announcing his presidential bid. Ronald Reagan, governor of California, who will become a 2-term president of the United States, announces his bid for president of the United States, not in California, not in Washington, D.C., but in Philadelphia, Mississippi, in Neshoba County, Philadelphia, Mississippi, in 1980. And the only reason why he does this is because in Neshoba County, Mississippi, this is the site where 3 civil rights workers were murdered in 1964. Nothing else have ever happened in Neshoba County, Mississippi, but that. And he goes there specifically to tell white Southerners who had been upset, who had been leaving the Democratic Party because of its support of expanding democracy and civil rights platform, that you have a home with us within the Republican Party. And we take segregationists. We take white supremacists. And we also believe, and this was Reagan's line, that government isn't the solution, government is the problem. And we've been saying that, they've been saying that for 40 years. So why would it surprise anybody that on January 6th, or even the last 2 weeks, that you would see Americans rallying behind this idea that government is the problem and justifying it through a deep-seated belief in racism? We go back to January 6, 2020. What motivated all those folk to show up at the nation's capital? The lie that the election was somehow fraudulent, the lie that the election was stolen. There's no evidence whatsoever. This is something conjured from thin air. But it was believable to so many. Why? Because of where the lie supposedly took place. It supposedly took place in Atlanta, in Philadelphia, in Milwaukee, in Detroit. All these places are cities where African Americans are the majority. The lie was believable because of that deep-seated belief still in the racism that black participation in democracy in an election, free and fair, somehow rendered that election illegitimate. Somehow rendered that election illegitimate. And so pervasive is that belief today. This is why we're seeing all this silliness around diversity, equity, and inclusion explain every fault in America. Planes falling out the sky. It's black people. It's women. What are you talking about? But it's clear because among those, this has always been the case in America, among those who do not believe in democracy, who do not believe in expanding democracy, they understand, have always understood, whether we're talking about the Civil War, we're talking about January 6th, we're talking about yesterday or today, that racism is the most powerful political tool that America has ever created. And you can do almost anything anti-democratic in the name of racism. And that's where we find ourselves today. So, what do we do about it? Last 2 minutes. I could just leave and just leave you like depressed. No, there is something that we can do about it. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We're just coming off the King holiday. I was down in Cincinnati on January 20th on King's holiday. I was down speaking at a wonderful sort of statewide, citywide commemoration of Dr. King. And I was glad to be there and not in Washington, D.C. on King Day. And I told them, I said, listen, I mean, literally, we were having this King celebration down in Cincinnati on that day. And I said, I said, I got a brother who's involved in politics. And, he's a congressman. And, one of the cool things about that, one of the bad things, like, I always get all the negative. I got an inbox full of hate, like white supremacists. Like, I'll tell you, brother. I was like, you tell him, just leave me alone. Right? But I get to, I shoot him a text message like, hey, Democratic National Conventions in Chicago. Want to take my girl day? Like, can you get me in? The girl's like, we're going. He's like, yeah, I got you, no problem. Right? So these events would come up, and I'll shoot him a text, and he's like, yeah, I'm on it. But this time I got a text from him, and he said, the inauguration's coming up, and I haven't heard from you. I was like, you're not either. But Dr. King, right? Dr. King, 1963, arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, fighting to end segregation in what was considered the most segregated city in Alabama. American apartheid was deeply rooted in Birmingham, Alabama. They had led this campaign to end segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. He gets arrested, and he writes this, probably the most powerful piece of literature in the 20th century America, Letter from Birmingham Jail, which many of my students encountered through high school. The state legislature is creating this little fake American history class, and one of the documents that it says that we must teach 5 documents, the Constitution. I'm like, yeah, we can teach the Constitution, give me that, right? But also Letter from Birmingham Jail. And I have a colleague who pointed out, he's like, yeah, they want us to teach the Letter from Birmingham Jail, but they don't want us to teach the reasons why he was in jail in the first place. And then this letter is so powerful. I mean, it's like if people actually listen, like if political conservatives actually listen, the right wing actually listen to Martin Luther King, like a speech, they'll be like, oh shit, he ain't a capitalist. Like, no, he's not. Right? He's a democratic socialist. And in the Letter from Birmingham Jail, he gives us this blueprint for what we should be doing when fighting to expand democracy, when fighting against the forces who are fundamentally anti-democratic. He gives us the blueprint. One of the things that he says, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And folk love to hear that. Right? And he would repeat it time and time again. March from Selma to Montgomery talks about the arc of the moral universe being long, but it bends towards justice. And that sounds nice because it gives us comfort. Like even in the most difficult times, like if the arc is going to bend towards justice, then we just got to let time pass and things will take care of itself. But he also says, he's like, that's not the end of it. He's like, well, the arc will only bend towards justice if there are people who are willing to exert the force necessary to bend it in that direction. Like, we have to be the force. And that history of African Americans laboring for democracy, laboring for others, laboring for a little bit of freedom, and laboring to extend and expand democracy. There's a history of people who are willing to sacrifice and struggle to bend that arc towards justice. So, how do we preserve democracy? Just three little quick things. First, we got to be knowledgeable. Dr. King talks about this in Letter from Birmingham Jail. He's like, I'm in Birmingham because I know what's going on in Birmingham. And in an era of heightened misinformation and disinformation, we have to be fundamentally aware. We have to be clued in to everything that's going on so we can identify when we're seeing the misinformation, when we're seeing the disinformation, and offer a counter response. One of the criticisms of Dr. King was that why he wrote that letter from Birmingham jail is because they said that he was an outsider. You're coming to Birmingham, you shouldn't be coming to Birmingham, Alabama. You're an outsider. You shouldn't come to St. Augustine. You shouldn't come to Selma because you're an outsider. Dr. King's response was, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And we all need to be fighting injustice. And the way to do that is to be connected, like to be webbed into these local communities. Especially in the moment that we find ourselves now where we're just being inundated, particularly at the highest levels of government, with acts and executive orders that are fundamentally eroding basic civil rights protections. So what can we do? There's not that much that we can do individually at that level right now, but there's a lot that we can do where we are. Whether we're talking about our schools, our school districts, our churches, our jobs, our companies that are beginning to follow the lead of what we're seeing, rolling back protections, rolling back diversity initiatives. You might not be able to do anything about USAID right now, or what's going on in the Justice Department right now, but you certainly can say something and speak up where we are, being connected and webbed into our communities. Dr. King said, in necessary to preserve democracy, you got to be urgent. He talks about the fierce urgency of now. One of the things, he says, people counsel him and civil rights activists and those who are fighting for freedom all the time. They say, be patient, be patient, be patient. That's that arc. It's going to bend towards justice. Just be patient. No. He said, the patience is the enemy of democracy. It's the enemy of freedom. The fierce urgency of now. In the moment, we have to act. Time is just a unit of measure. It is not a social force capable of creating change. If you wait, and he says those who counsel patience have the luxury of waiting, but those who are impacted have to act. So we need to act with them. The fierce urgency of now. He counsels being nonviolent. Now, this was a little bit hard for me to swallow. Growing up as a youngster, I didn't appreciate the power of nonviolent direct action. And it wasn't until I went to college and began to study civil rights that I was like, oh man, this is powerful. And in this moment, where now us as citizens who believe in democracy are up against the federal government, state power, state apparatus that we've never seen before, we are outgunned. Totally. It always amazed me when you have those true Second Amendment folk who are like, I've had conversation with more than a few of them. There's a lot of them in Ohio, it turns out. That they said, well, I need my 7, 15, 22 assault rifle to keep the government honest. They have nuclear weapons, right? Like there's nothing that you can possibly harbor in your arsenal that is going to keep the federal government, state power here, from doing whatever they want. But what we've seen with nonviolent direct action is that the power of the people and the willingness to put your bodies on the line and to create what Dr. King calls creative tension, that's powerful. That changes, that can move armies, that can part seas. And in this moment where we find ourselves and understanding what the opposition is, then I think we need to lean into that heavily. The last thing, we have to be bold. This speaks to the urgency. This speaks to creative tension. Dr. King was criticized. He writes about this in a letter from Birmingham jail about being an extremist. He's like, oh, you're an extremist, criticized, right, by white moderates in Alabama, preachers in Alabama, saying that he's an extremist. And Dr. King says, you know, there's only two types. He said there's two types of extremists. He said there's extremists for injustice and extremists for justice. And he said there's really only one question then. He said, what type of extremist are you going to be? And he said, when facing the forces who are opposed to democracy, he said, we really only have one choice, and that is to be extremists for justice. And what does that entail? And in this moment, and Dr. King pulled no punches, this is what the power of nonviolence is so understated. Because just as he said, there's two types of extremists, extremists for injustice, extremists for justice. He said there's only two types of laws. He said there's unjust laws and just laws. That's it. He said just laws, we have an obligation to listen to abide by. But he also said we have an equally strong obligation to challenge unjust laws. Because he said unjust laws are no laws at all. Unjust laws are those that question people's humanity. Unjust laws are those that rob people of their dignity. Unjust laws are those that limit democracy and don't expand democracy. Unjust laws are those that separate families, that take your neighbors out of their homes and schools and churches, off of playgrounds, off of jobs, and incarcerate them. And he said, those laws, we have an obligation to fight against. But he said, when you do, he said, you do so openly. You do so publicly. You don't hide behind anonymity. He said, when you do that, you lose the moral authority. You lose the moral high ground. That means you have to be willing to pay the penalty. What does it mean for all those? I got a lot of emails to send out to former students who wanted to be on the right side of history with the abolitionists. All right, now's your time. Now's your time to be a conductor on the Underground Railroad. What are you going to do when ICE knocks on a neighbor's door? Trying to take your community member, your neighbor, your family member, somebody else's family, somebody else's best friend, some child. What do you do then? That's the unjust law. If we want to preserve our democracy, which is far from perfect, but it's the only thing that we got, then we have to be willing to be bold in this moment, to be called to action. That's what African Americans have been laboring for. And I think that's what we're called to do today. Thank you very much. No, I ran a little over. I got a little excited. Hopefully we can still have some time for some questions.
Yeah, let's take a little bit of time for Q&As. I know there's some people who had obligations immediately after this, so if you need to go, please go.
Yeah, I'm late already.
No, you're fine.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for coming. Is there anybody who has any kind of questions that they want to ask?
My question is that do you believe in modernized segregation, and some context behind that, meaning that when desegregation was no longer a thing and everybody was together in one building, you seen African Americans start to flood in, but you also seen Caucasian Americans flood out, and that leaves rural areas for destruction and, oh, we don't care about those people anymore. And so once you do that, you have bad schools, and then those children end up getting bad jobs and then end up making bad decisions and then living in those same areas and then giving birth to another kid generation of kids, and then it repeats itself. So that's what I believe by modernization, segregation. And if you do believe in that, do you believe that there's ever a way to break that cycle?
Yeah, no, so I get your point. It's a great point. And it speaks to something that African American activists coming out of the civil rights era into the Black Power era were very much worried about. And saying, Stokely Carmichael, for example, Kwame Ture, he talks about desegregation. And he says, I'm not opposed to integrating institutions. I'm not opposed to getting rid of separate but equal. I understand the necessity of doing that. But we can't do it on simply white folks' terms. And that's what we have done. So what we have done then is early on with schools, for example, we'll talk about communities in a second, with schools, for example, desegregation proceeded by closing black schools, firing black teachers and black administrators. We saw this in the South, right? And then moving those students, black students, over to white schools. All of that history, all of that, the commitment, the love that teachers had for their students, all that was lost. So we didn't have desegregation on an equitable basis. It was solely on white folks' terms. And so we've never, and even with that, what we wound up seeing in the 1970s, like the height of school desegregation, the height of integration in our public education system was in the 1970s, the early 1980s. That was it, it peaked then. And it's been going backsliding ever since. And we see the same thing with housing desegregation. We actually have very few in America. We have very few racially integrated communities. Very few. And people like, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, in the neighborhood that I live in Brooklyn, in Crown Heights. My parents have a home that is now probably majority white. Like I used to walk around the streets and look for white folk. Now I walk around looking for black folk. It never actually integrated. There was a point where like, oh, this is a really integrated. No, it was transitioning, right? It was transitioning. So the point that you said, what America did, and this goes back to what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, is really unique. And it was unlike other sort of Western European countries, right? Because in Western European countries, what they did with sort of marginalized poor communities of color is they never gave up their cities. So poverty in France, in Paris, was never in the city, it was in the suburbs. Only in America, because we had the land and we have automobiles and we created this infrastructure, this highway infrastructure, that we abandoned, white Americans abandoned urban spaces as a whole. And left it, as you were pointing out, to poor black folk, to poor Latinos, to poor immigrants, right, who could not get out, and you create housing policies that don't allow them to leave, and then you disinvest in those communities. And so that's what we saw. But now with gentrification and the realization that, it doesn't make any sense for me to commute for 3 hours paying the high cost of oil, what we're seeing is now America, some folk are like, oh, we're becoming more racially integrated. No, we're transitioning. So now these outer ring suburbs that black folk couldn't get into are now moving out to, but then we're seeing the investment moving into cities. So we're just doing this displacement game again. And if we're not careful, we will just be pushing poverty out to the suburbs. People are like, well, suburbs can't be poor. Look at Europe. That's exactly so we're moving to a more European model. Doesn't mean we don't have to. We just have to be cognizant of what we're doing. And if we're cognizant of it, then we can hopefully reverse it and say, no. It's not about displacement. Everyone should have equitable resources, equitable access to quality schools and the like. But place matters. Your zip code, you tell me, give me the zip code, the race, and the gender of any 5-year-old in America, and you can almost predict with near certainty their life outcomes. That shouldn't be. It just shouldn't be. But that's still the case today. So I agree with you. Those are issues that we have to deal with.
Thank you for that question. Do we have any other questions?
So obviously, stated in the presentation in Dr. King's letter, like the importance of being connected. As someone who is not at all like active on social media, what do you think would be the best way to be connected, or like find groups to be connected with outside of social media, or is that something that's like too difficult to do in this day and age?
No, it's like he just said, how do I find people, right? Like I feel you know, that's what we should be. That's the question that we should be asking, right? How do we find people again, right? How do we? Social media is just a communication tool, right? And we feel more connected really than we actually are, right? It's great for sharing ideas and this, that, and the other, but we got to have the human connection. And one of the things that comes out of the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, that civil rights activists, you ever meet them and talk to them, they'll say that we had to build these bonds of trust because what we were being asked to do and risk our lives, like I couldn't do that if I didn't trust that you were going to be right there with me. And that only comes from sort of a face-to-face interaction, and not just seeing a person, but developing, having conversation. So social media can help facilitate that, but in and of itself is not enough. And so, and that's also part of the beauty of being in university, right? To be, I mean, this is community. Like, who do we talk to in our classes? What organizations beyond the fraternities and the sororities and the clubs, right? But what organizations are actually thinking about something and talking about this? It would be nice if the fraternities and sororities and the others did that. I was in a fraternity. We didn't do much of that. And it was frustrating, right? I thought we were going to lead the revolution, and it did not happen, right? We're getting there now, 35 years later, right? But it's you know, wherever two people are, that's community. It's just, you know, sort of saying, you know, hi, who are you? Right? What are you thinking? What do you see? What can I learn from you? And we don't do enough of that. Right? We know more people, we're connected to more people, and yet at the same time, connected to fewer. So I say it's just, you know, whoever's around you is your community. Wherever you are is your community. It's just up to us reaching out and building those bridges. And I don't think it's a stretch to say you're not the only one, right? But y'all as students, you're also coming through the pandemic, right? And the sense of isolation. Like I was in the pandemic, I was like, I don't gotta talk to nobody. Like this is great. Like but I understand that social development, right? I mean, in that sense of isolation can get exacerbated in that particular moment. Right? And we haven't done a great job by shoving these phones in your hand and say everything has to be on social media. We just gotta get back to basics. And in a moment like this, where people are being asked to challenge authority, to preserve democracy, then the basics are really going to be important, right? Because you're going to have a human connection, right, with people in order to do the things that are going to be necessary in the moment.
Let's try to do these two really quick. Actually, your hand was up first.
Oh, I'm curious, like, the last slide at the top was be knowledgeable.
Yeah.
And we live in a time when people get their knowledge from, like, not very well curated sources.
Yes.
What, do you have any recommendations, any, like, news sources that you follow and trust, or recommendations for the rest of us?
Yeah, no. So, not just for the rest of us, I think because everything is under assault. It's like you got to go to different sources for everything. But it's always what's the source, right? So, I mean, two things. A lesson that I think political scientists and historians and sociologists and anthropologists will be looking at when they go back in this moment and say, okay, well, what happened in that last election, right, with messaging and the like. And if you look at what the messaging was on the part of the Democratic Party, like they said everything, like right, like they weren't, like everything, Project 25, all this other stuff, like the messaging wasn't the problem. It was all the disinformation and misinformation so that message never broke through. So critical media literacy, understanding sources, checking sources, following that trail is like critically important. I mean, not just for us. I mean, all, you know, as adults, as hopefully students here, but for folk who aren't like trained in like asking the simple question of what's the source, like that poses a real problem. And we're being inundated, right? This isn't just like, well, the newspaper said, and the one newspaper, like you are constantly being bombarded and given as much screen time as people are on their phones, right? Like how much fact checking like is being done. So it's always good to have sort of curated sources, right? Dependent upon the subject. But now that is even, right? Because journalists and news organizations are now sort of knuckling under, right? So independent media is going to be critical in this moment, but it's really just fact checking everything for ourselves, right? To say, okay, what is the source? Where is this coming from? It doesn't take that long, but we have to do it. If I don't understand the source, sometimes I see stuff like online on social media, I'm like, oh man, this is great. You ain't got no source. Well, I don't know what is that? It's just feeding into what I wanted to believe. We constantly have to check the source. I have students who take my classes at Ohio State, and they're repeat offenders, right? They just keep coming. I can't get rid of them, right? But they're always the best students. But when I get a new student who comes in, and I have these old, the old students who have taken me, 2, 3, 4 classes and stuff. When they get a new student come in, the student will come in, U.S. History or Civil Rights, and they'll raise their hand. They'll say something crazy, right? They'll say something from Fox News that they heard online, right? And my response to that is simply, what's the source? And when my other students hear me say, in response to a point that somebody made, what's the source? They start giggling. Because they're like, oh, this kid's about to get lit up now by Dr. Jeffries, right? What's the source? What's the source? Just someone convince me. Convince me with your source. I'll say this just once, real quick. Part of the problem that we have now is not that people can't find the sources. Like what the Democratic Party was saying, for example, right? About their policies and what Kamala Harris, it was all clear, right? The problem is in actually finding and locating source information and what's true. The problem is that people just don't want to believe it. Right? People on the political right in particular. Now this is going to be a separate problem for us now, right? But just for those on the political left. But for people on the political right in this era of MAGA, like politics on the right has become like religion. It's become like the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? Because the Abrahamic religions, all of them, are rooted in faith. And faith is belief in the absence of fact. So there's the two things that my brother and I, just in bunk beds as kids, we debating everything, right? And we'll debate anything, just, issues we believe, issues we don't believe, like, yes, this is good. The two things we don't debate people's humanity. I'm not going to debate whether or not somebody has a right to be their authentic self. And the other thing we both agree on, and we really don't agree on anything, right? We both agree on is that we don't debate faith. We don't debate religion. And we'll discuss religion. You can learn from religion. You can talk about it, but you can't move somebody, right? Because they always say, no, this is what I believe. Like, okay, that's your faith. But politics should not be like religion. So what do we do when knowing what the source information is and we present it to people and they're like, nope, we just don't believe that. Like that's where we are. So it's not just us trying to figure out, okay, what's true or not. It's like, we can figure that out. It's not that hard. We can figure out the science of COVID. It wasn't that difficult. It's that once you present it, people are like, no, we just choose not to believe it. I don't know what to do with that. Like, how do you convince people? I'm convinced that you don't try anymore. Unless you really, really love them. Like, that's your family member. Go ahead. Go for it. Like, we need those conversations. That's not I don't have energy for that. So now it's about preserving democracy isn't a debate. It's about power plays. Like, how are you just going to do it? So the sharing of information has to be on our side. Sharing for those who believe in democracy. But I don't think you're going to win many people over just simply by presenting facts. Not in this moment anymore. That's not where we are. These aren't policy debates. Right? They really are not policy debates. I think the sooner we realize that, we'll realize the urgency of the situation and how fragile this moment actually is. Like, democracies don't die in the darkness. Democracies die in the light. And we're going to see it happen. We're seeing it eroding in front of us. Now, The thing that we do have to worry about, though, on the truth and fact side, is what can we believe from the federal government now? What can we believe from federal sources that we used to be able to trust? Like, you can't trust it anymore. You can't trust some news organization. Like that is really, really problematic. And I don't have a good answer to that. But I know if it continues to erode, we're going to be in a much worse situation. Because you can't trust anything. That's the power of what Donald Trump did, actually, by saying you cannot trust the news. So now suddenly nobody believes anything. Everything is fake. You question it, so you can't present to them facts. But what if we can't actually get to know what actually is going on? So it has the same effect. And that really scares me. And it scares me too that our press, our fourth estate, is caving in the ways that they are. I mean, bending the knee, whether it's the Washington Post and now CBS, and signing these settlements, right, with the Trump administration because he was offended by their, running a story on this, that, and the other. Like I was hoping that they would push back, they're not. And so that is going to have to come from spreading the word, talking about social media. Alternative means of communication are actually going to be really important for getting out what's actually occurring and what's happening, especially when we're being hit by so much. So when you figure it out, you let me know.
All right. Well, I think we're pretty much at time. There's one more question.
I'll be quick. Go ahead.
Do it.
It kind of relates to what you just ended off with. But my question is, what is keeping our communities divided, and why do they want it like that?
Yeah. So I can't be quick with that. But I think we actually do, and I tried to point it out here. In American society, like the role of racism, like we still to this day underestimate how powerful it is. You know, all these conversations about, why do people vote for Donald Trump? There's two reasons, right? One, you have voters who are animated by his racism. Like they were really animated by his racism. Like they motivate, like yes, we're happy. And now we're seeing that in sort of policy. But I think the majority of folk who voted for him were not animated by his racism, but were okay by it. They're okay with it. They're okay with it. They're like, I can live with it. It's not going to impact me. But, and then we're having these arguments about eggs. It's like, it's not about fucking eggs. Right? It's about it's the explanation. And this is the power of racism. It's not only going to animate people, but now you have people saying, well, the reason why eggs are high is because of the influx of migrant laborers. Like, no, that's not the reason. The reason why I don't have a job is because Haitian immigrants are eating cats and dogs in Springfield, Illinois. What kind of nonsense is that? So it's the explanation. It's rooted in this racism, and it becomes believable. It's January 6th all over again. It's believable because of we've never actually dealt with that which is in our DNA. And that's the power of it. That it has people believing this stuff, and it's going to lead them off a cliff. And we're all on the same damn train. Like they go, we go. So we have to deal with that. So people say, well, it was the economy and this, that, and that. Yeah, but like we can't set that aside. And so when we talk about, well, if you're talking about it separating us, that ain't separating. Like we can talk about race. We got to get away from this silliness around colorblindness. Like I see every single one of y'all. But like identifying and seeing race is not the problem. It's discriminating against people on the basis of it. Leaning into these negative stereotypes on the basis of it. Like we're not going to erase people. And that's what they're trying to do. And that's not going to work. Like we're here. Race is also a reflection of our cultural ancestry. That's how we use it in America. It's biologically meaningless, but socially real. And if race isn't real, racism sure is. And the political uses of it are what we're dealing with now. Because we've never actually stopped doing it. but we just never realized. Last thing, I promise I'll shut up. We never actually realized how powerful it was in the modern era. I didn't either. Like somebody asked me the other day, I was speaking at Columbus Library, and they said, well, help me understand why Barack Obama could be elected twice, and then we get Donald Trump 2 times as well. I said the answer to that, I didn't realize what the answer to that was, why Barack Obama won, until Donald Trump won, and the way he won. And I realized that certainly Barack Obama did what he needed to do, but John McCain and Mitt Romney actually lost. They could have won. They weren't racist enough. They were not racist enough. When John McCain is confronted with the woman in the debate and she's like, he's a Muslim. He's like, no, like we're not gonna do that game. Mitt Romney the same way. They took principled stands against that. So that population, which was significant, I didn't realize how big it was, were animated by the racism. They were like, we don't want anything to do with it. They're not speaking to us. Donald Trump comes around and taps into that, and what he realizes is that all those other voters were gonna be okay with it. At 80%, I can say whatever the hell I wanna say. Then we'll be totally fine with it. But that racism is not gonna lean into that, and I'm gonna get that. So that's where we are. We gotta deal with that. We gotta acknowledge that. Acknowledge doesn't mean we're bad people, it just means we're Americans. That's who we are. Once we acknowledge it, we can move past it.
Thank you so much. I just want to go ahead and give a shout out to JAG, the Humanitarian Fellows, the Schwartz Fund, the Special Events Committee, Leaders of the Line. These are all different areas of campus that have contributed to bring Dr. Jeffries here today. So just a huge shout out to everybody who helped make this possible. Thank you.